Thanks again for joining us today for the Business After Windows QA sessions. Just remember, during these sessions, you can submit your questions on Twitter by tweeting at BizAfterWindows with the hashtag #TheNewCloud. Up next, we'll be talking to Paul Giurata, who spoke on Life After Windows, 10 Ways User Experience Design Will Change. Paul Giurata is the managing partner of Catalyst and is considered one of the preeminent UI application architects in the U.S. with operating experience in diverse technology companies. Paul began his user experience career at Apple on media-rich learning environments for children. Hello, Paul. How are you doing?
Good, good. I'm good. Nice to be able to spend some time with everybody on this today.
Absolutely. Do you want to go ahead and give us a quick recap of your presentation,
Yeah.
and then we can talk about questions and other things?
Yeah, let me kind of recap. There were 10 points I wanted to cover, and just from a perspective viewpoint. So Catalyst, as Jennifer was saying, Catalyst is a firm that does user experience design and development very narrowly for software applications. Much of what we do is cloud-based in financial services, in healthcare, life sciences, and we've done a lot of stuff. We've done about 500 pieces of software. We've been around for about 20 years. So we've got, I would like to think we've got a pretty good long view of this issue. And just to summarize my comments, what I was mentioning is that, for Windows, what Windows did is it provided, as everyone knows, it provided that hardware control, computation, storage, network access, the access to your applications, and then your own personal workspace. You went, sat down in your Windows machine, you had a personal workspace. Now, what's going to happen if Windows and other operating systems start to go away? Well, our feeling is that much of that functionality will just move to the cloud. Network access, obviously in the cloud, applications in the cloud, that computational capability in the cloud, storage, and a big part of it is that personal workspace will be cloud-based. Kind of the only thing that doesn't evolve is the local hardware control, but none of us are concerned if it's in the cloud. We're not concerned about controlling the hardware. So what's going to change real quickly? One is people are going to become much more device agnostic. They're going to want to be able to access those applications that they need to work on any device. Maybe not always any device, but across a range of devices. The solutions that we are going to be needing to deliver are going to cater to a much broader audience. It will no longer be, well, this is for our organization, our ERP system inside our organization, and everybody has to be inside the VPN and inside the firewall. They can't get it. All of a sudden, the connected constellation is going to be much, much greater. Another factor is that the experience will be much more designed based on the work pattern as opposed to the operating system. So in other words, right now, if I go work on Excel on my Mac and Excel on a Windows, it's very difficult to go back and forth. People won't want, because of the impact of the operating system, people won't want that. They're going to want to have it be access the work they need to do. Workspaces will become portable. Experience will be responsive, adaptive, and unified. By unified, I mean consistent across it. If you're looking at your retirement portfolio on your notebook or on your tablet on the weekend, you want that experience to be the same. We think that's going to happen. There will be an acceleration away from thick client software. And a lot of that's happened right now. For the most part, companies doing new software are doing it being cloud-based. But that will even get further accelerated, and there will be very small number of applications that will actually have to be thick client, and some of those will be ones that have to control instruments, like for diagnostic medical situations or controlling big pieces of equipment. Other than that, there will be a big mass exodus away from thick client. Simplification will be key. As everyone knows, when you look at your iPhone, you don't really have an ERP on your iPhone anymore, or never did. It's smaller individual applications that you use for different things, but that overall functionality is there, but they're in smaller pieces. And two more things, or a couple more things, the era of giant applications will really end. It's going to be more of a constellation of smaller apps. Another aspect of it is we're going to have to get really clear on what the true mobile setting is. It won't be that you'll say, well, I'm going to do everything on all my devices. That's not really what's going to work. You might have somebody who says, I'm going to go out in the field, I'm going to take water samples in the field because that's what I have to do, and then the testing in the lab will be done in the lab. So the mobile-based piece of work will be, I want to use a phone or I want to use a tablet to collect the sample, but not to run the test and not to do the analysis. Two more things. Data, enhancing data will be a much bigger part of the experience that people are after. You're telling me that the stock price just went down on Coke? Tell me a little bit more. What's happening? Oh, they're using bromine. Oh, okay, they're getting called on the carpet for using toxics. Okay, I can knit together the story, and people will want to knit together their own stories with enhanced data. That's part of what we will deliver as application design people and user experience. And then the last thing is that people are going to want to see a single infrastructure serving multiple devices. They're not going to want to say, well, we have a whole area here that's for tablet and smartphones, and then we have a whole other infrastructure for web. They're going to want to have a common infrastructure. So that's just a quick summary, and by all means, let's open it up for questions.
Great. Well, I have a couple of questions here that we've already received. Okay. One is, do you see the user interfaces changing so that they can detect the user's demographics and behave accordingly? For instance, asking for a birth year and automatically increasing fonts for older people on websites, or have more parallax effects for the younger ones?
I don't really think that will be such a prominent thing. I don't think there is that much value. I do feel that there will be a need for people to say, hey, can I adjust the fonts and do it on their own? But I don't anticipate detecting for demographics. Detecting for the device, absolutely, but I wouldn't see demographics.
Okay, great answer. So the second question, because I think we covered the first one pretty good. Second one would be, in a device-agnostic world, do you recommend a mobile first, a web first, or a centralized HTML5 type cross-device development?
Well, that's a very good question. So the answer to that, it depends on what the lead usage is. If it's a as an example, if it's a mobile-based field service software where 80% of the time, 80% of the people are using it in the field, then do mobile first, which could be tablet or could be phone, and do that first. Okay. In other cases where it's going to be balanced across there, we would absolutely say look for doing a unified design when you set off and say, okay, or maybe start with web, but then you do the responsiveness so that it is responsive to tablet, but very much looking for trying to have one common design approach that goes across different devices. Now, what that doesn't mean is that you're absolutely going to do it all with HTML and JavaScript. May not be the case. You may still say, well, I've got a common design, and I'm going to do that common design, but because I have native functionality that I'm trying to keep track of on access on a smartphone, it may still be a native application that has a common design. But the more of being able to move forward, having a unified experience and being able to have one design development effort, that certainly is where people are going to want to go. And then one last thing I'll mention about that is that there's an issue about, well, what do we do to develop it? The real question that comes up is if you're the VP of development or director of development, and after it's over and you're sitting there looking at that and go, wow, I've got one code base for Android, I've got another code base for iOS, I've got a web code base, now I've got to go to the CEO and say, I've got to have 3 development teams, I've got to marshal those forward on different development schedules. Any of us have been in software know that that's not going to be the place we want to be.
I'm sure it gets confusing to have so many different codes as well. Yep. I guess we'll go on to the next one. And what is the timeline, in your opinion, when the OS will become device agnostic?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the uh, operating system will become device agnostic. I think if you say an operating system is part of what controls the device, I think the operating systems will continue to be very device specific. The what I think will become device agnostic are the applications that people want to access. They're not going to care. So if I've got an investment portfolio, whether I want to access it on my Windows machine or my iPhone, I want the experience to be the same, and I don't want to have to kind of grovel my way through the Mac interface and through the Windows interface. I want to come in, I want to look at my portfolio, I want to manage it. So it's the applications that will be much more device agnostic, not the OS.
Okay, absolutely. I see what you say there. I guess we'll go on to the next one. Paul, I enjoyed your presentation. Question, you mentioned how users will stop using certain software if simplification is not addressed. I actually see this with consumer applications today where it's easy to jump from app to app, but not in the business realm, data migration. Oh, not in the business realm. Data migration and user training is too painful. How can software architects address this moving forward? That's a good question.
Okay, it is a very good question. What I would say about that is that we would love to think on the business side that we are somewhat immune to this issue of simplicity, but I actually don't think we will be. And the biggest driver on that is that what keeps people on, what historically kept people on their applications that they weren't so happy about was they wrote a big check and they bought a license and they owned it, and the accounting department was saying, you got 2 more, 3 more years to depreciate that. Now, people will have options. It may mean a data migration, but they will have options that they can look for. So I think the reality of it is, if it's an organization and they are paying for a SaaS offering and they are realizing that they're not using it, they might be paying $1,000, $5,000, $15,000 a month, and they're not using it, they will find ways to move off that. And what I would say is, there aren't so many applications where data migration is really a huge issue. There are some, no doubt. What I would say, so how do you address it? The way that we found you can address it is to basically say that you look at a piece of software and you say and you try to identify what we call this tracer bullet path, which is if you fired a bullet through the software, which is probably not a very good idea, you would, and you said, I want that bullet to go where 80% of the people spend 80% of the time. Surprisingly enough, you'll find it's a very small number of views. If you did it through an investment piece of software, it's about 4 views. Okay? If you did it through other pieces of software, you might get a dozen. And so it's a little bit like if you say, well, what's the tracer bullet path in a house? Well, it's pretty much the kitchens, the bedrooms, the bathrooms. Okay? If you get that right, you really simplify it as much as possible. You've done a lot in terms of simplifying that setting. So our feeling is you define where that tracer bullet path is, and then you design the software to be optimized for those work areas. So if you have a place where you're trading, you do that. If you have and you optimize for that. If you have a place in your investment portfolio where you're comparing things together, you optimize for that. So we think that the key to that, one of the keys to the simplification is defining the work areas and designing around that. And what you'll find is you'll have pieces of software that might have been 40 screens of software that all of a sudden look like 15 screens. They're a lot more sophisticated, but much smaller number of views.
And how would you suggest small businesses and anyone else interested in this would find that tracer route that you're talking about?
You know what? You really spend time, you talk to your users and figure out what they're doing, and you define what are the scenarios that users do. What do they do? And figure out what screens are required to do that. As opposed to what a lot of us do in our software is we design the software around the data model. We've got a screen for everything. We've got a screen for customers. We've got a screen for parts. We've got a screen for this. We've got a screen for that. Whereas if you say, tell me what the scenarios are that are the most valuable, and then you figure out, well, what's in the software that they need to use.
Very good. I think that'll definitely be of help. Let's move on. I have another question. When you talk about solutions catering to a more connected constellations, isn't being connected a function of permissions and authorization and the transfer level? For example, LAN, WAN, or cloud. And they said, great talk. Thanks for your insight.
I would say that this notion about a broader connected constellation is that not so much about the technical, is it a LAN, WAN, or that sort of thing, but it's more of the issue that if you have, let's say that you're doing, as an example, if you've got data and that data is in the cloud and you've got computational capability and you've got the ability to connect more users, the things you will think about doing will be broader. So in other words, let's just talk about this Ebola situation. So right now, people were testing for Ebola, there's a small number of tests that can test a number of different fevers and potentially identify Ebola or identify what it is, what the condition is other than Ebola. So you've got a test and an instrument, you report some results. But if you collected all that data, it makes it easier to do something like, well, we could track the outbreak of cases geographically. We could see how it moves. We could report on what things are more effective. So it's the fact that you've got this data and computational ability in the cloud and the ability to connect people that it gives you a broader set of options that you could consider doing because you've got that enabling piece in there. And what I would say, one way to think of it is that if you look at the applications that you're dealing with, the software that you deal with, it probably has some life cycle. So if you're testing for Ebola, you collect a sample, you do the test, you get the test back to the doctor. And then at some point there is some information that gets reported. Well, if you have this collected constellation, in a lot of cases lets you get to a bigger piece of that life cycle of what you're dealing with and involve more people. Whereas historically, when it was on a Windows machine, inside a building with a LAN, we were constrained by who we could reach out to.
Interesting. Okay, I see what you mean by the connected constellations. We'll move forward, and do you have any suggestions on UX tools that small businesses can use to kind of improve, applications, any of their own websites, anything like that?
You know what? That's a tough question. What I would say is it's less about the tools and more about being able to commit to getting enough resources in place that you can evolve not just your websites, but evolve your web-based software on a systematic basis. So if you could get to the point where you had enough design and UI development resources so that every 90 to 120 days you could be doing a point release and adding more functionality, I think that will get you much farther than just the tools. So that's what I think you need in place, is to try to shoot for this small core little group of UI, user experience resources that really know this, that you could have them marshaling on, regularly doing updates, and that'll move your stuff forward most effectively. And also, your competitors are probably going to be doing that, so you're going to want to try to get that in place.
Absolutely, great insight. So in that case, you probably want to talk about, anybody looking for in-house versus out-house UX design. What would your suggestions be on that?
Okay, it's an interesting topic. So first off, the UI design and development has gotten very complex across devices. Okay, and it's gotten very expensive. So, I mean, there are situations where, I mean, we would talk, a UI designer, an individual UI designer might have a compensation package that could range from $125,000 to $150,000. I mean, anybody on this phone call listening to that knows that you don't want to be hiring a lot of that kind of resource. So they're hard to get, they're hard to keep. The other part of it is they're a little bit like your accounting firm and your legal firm. You need them for a certain amount of time, but then you don't always need them. So you want to be careful about the what you have in place. And what I would say in general, you need a design system that you could put across your applications that you might rely on an outside firm to do it, particularly if it goes across devices. Then once that's in place, you want somebody who can do uh, that work inside your organization. And again, you probably want a relatively small group of people, but you want to have that core point where you've got enough activity, enough people in place that you can have that ongoing activity. So to be honest with you, I think it's a balance where you want to get some design system in place that gets you a common user experience across devices. That's a hard thing to do. Not a lot of people can really do that. Then have that design system get applied consistently by people that you bring inside that aren't those super pricey people but can still get good work done.
Absolutely. I think that applies to a lot of different kind of things going on for small businesses. I know I've talked to other people about social media, in-house and outhouse, so UX is a little different, of course. But we have one more question. I think we have enough time for it. This one asked, Windows is such a powerful and iconic brand. Do you really think it will die, or did you mean evolve? Can you elaborate, please?
Was it Windows? Windows?
Windows, yes.
Well, uh, you know, we had some really big iconic brands a long time ago. Southern Pacific Railroad, Union Pacific. I mean, there was a time in history where there were some really big brands that were very prominent in this country, and they are no longer prominent. I think the 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 so I think it was really up in the air. I think that there are, you get to a point where, I mean, there was a point where Windows was everybody was dealing with the Windows on their machine, but Windows was so critical because it was actually how you controlled the microprocessor that was controlling the instrument and controlling the network. Well, our need for that is going to be much less now, and as people, individuals, users, we don't have that need because we don't care about the device that we're sitting in front of accessing our applications. So I think it remains to be seen. I think there are a lot of in Silicon Valley over the years there have been organizations that have ceased to be of value. Netscape as an example, Northern Telecom as an example. I mean, we've seen organizations that no longer have been relevant. And I think Microsoft will have to maintain that relevance, try to find a way to do it. There may be a situation where people say, it just isn't. There just isn't that much relevance. And not to say that they also have a couple people knocking at their door like Google, who are certainly formidable to play. So I think it remains to be seen.
Great insight. So we just had another question come across Twitter.
Okay.
How does new design trends like parallax affect life after Windows? Can you kind of define what parallax is for maybe someone who doesn't know in the audience?
No, I don't think I can give a really good, clear definition of parallax. But to comment on just general design trends on life after Windows, this is what I think is really. And it's not just Windows, it would be a diminishing use of impact of the OS. And I think the major design trend is that, we will no longer have to shoehorn things into a standard operating system metaphor. In other words, we're not going to have everything in the world happen under a file, edit, view, menu. That won't exist. So I think that's the biggest trend that will change is that the design of the UI will be based more around the business patterns than encapsulated in a standard operating system format. You see much of that on the web, but I don't think it will continue to evolve that way.
Interesting. Okay, so is there anything you'd like to wrap up this Q&A session with? Anything you'd like to leave our audience with before we go off the air?
I think the one last thing that I would say is I think what this is all, this life after Windows is really pointing to in a very significant way for people who are designing user experience is that the experience will be across multiple devices, and people will want consistency across devices because they're going to move from device more and more. And when they move, they're interested in what they could do on that. So I think this idea of a unified experience across devices from a user experience viewpoint is going to become more and more critical.
Absolutely. I think just from my own experience, that would be extremely helpful. We all have so many devices we're handling every day, too.
Exactly.
All right. So I think that's all the time we have, unless there's anything else you'd like to bring up, you'd like to maybe explain a little bit more.
No, I think that's got it. I think the questions were really good. I appreciate everybody's time and the thoughtful questions, and wish you all the best.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again for joining us today. To catch the next session, all you need to do is return to Business After Windows, scroll down to the Q&A session schedule, and click on the live Q&A button. Have a nice day, and we'll see you next session.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.